The first tiger arrived on a Tuesday. Nikolai Volkov saw it from his window at dawn, a shadow moving between the birch trees, too large to be a wolf, too deliberate to be a deer. The Amur tiger circled his cabin twice, paused at the edge of his water-filled trench, and sat down in the snow to watch him. It didn't leave for 6 hours. Siberian frontier, Russian Far East, February 1892. The worst winter in 40 years had driven the tigers down from the mountains, and now a 17-year-old exile was about to discover whether his neighbors had been right to laugh at him. 8 months earlier, Nikolai had done something that made the entire settlement question his sanity. "The boy is digging a ditch," Sergei Petrov announced at the trading post, vodka in hand, disbelief in his voice. A ditch around his cabin, filling it with water from the hot spring. The men laughed. Of course they laughed. Petrov had survived 28 winters in tiger country. He'd killed 6 of the great cats himself, knew their habits, their hunting patterns, their terrible patience. He'd seen what those animals could do to a man, had buried friends who thought they understood the forest until the forest taught them otherwise. And here was this city boy, this political exile from St. Petersburg, who'd never seen snow deeper than his ankles until last year, digging a hole in the ground like it would protect him from anything. "Let him dig," said Ivan Kozlov, the settlement's best tracker. He'd spent 20 years following tiger prints through the taiga, reading their intentions in bent grass and scattered snow. He'll learn. They all learn eventually. The ones who survive anyway. The other men nodded, returning to their drinks. They'd all seen newcomers try strange things. Most learned quickly. Some didn't live long enough to learn at all. Nikolai heard about the laughter. He kept digging. The trench took him 3 months, 6 feet wide, 5 feet deep, 40 yards of frozen earth moved by hand, one pickaxe stroke at a time. The permafrost fought him every inch. Soil that had been frozen since before his grandfather was born, resisting each swing with the stubbornness of stone. His palms bled through his gloves. His back screamed protests that he learned to ignore. His neighbors walked past and shook their heads at the waste of effort. 12,000 pounds of earth, Kozlov calculated one afternoon, watching Nikolai haul another bucket of frozen soil from the deepening trench. That's what you're moving, 12,000 pounds in a Siberian winter by yourself, for a ditch. Nikolai didn't stop working. 15,000 actually, I measured. And you think this will stop a tiger? I think it might. Kozlov laughed and walked away, but something in the boy's certainty made him glance back twice. "Why water?" Father Dmitri asked one afternoon in late October, watching Nikolai reinforce the trench walls with timber planks. The priest was the only one who bothered to ask instead of mock. He'd watched this strange boy since his arrival, watched him survive his first winter through stubbornness and intelligence rather than experience, watched him refuse to quit, despite every reason to give up. Why not a fence like everyone else? Good timber is plentiful here. Iron is available from the trading post. You could build proper walls. Nikolai drove another stake into the frozen ground, securing a plank that would keep the trench walls from collapsing when spring thaw came. My grandfather was a military engineer, built fortifications for the Tsar. He used to say that water stops what walls cannot. Your grandfather never met an Amur tiger. No, Nikolai admitted, but he met cavalry charges, Cossacks on horseback, coming at full gallop with sabers drawn, artillery barrages that could flatten stone walls, armies that had conquered half of Europe. He said a water barrier attacks the mind, not the body. An enemy who won't approach can't win, no matter how strong he is. Father Dmitri looked at the steaming water, already filling the lower sections of the trench. The hot spring connection had been Nikolai's masterstroke. Thermal water that would stay liquid even in the depths of Siberian winter when temperatures dropped to 40 below and ordinary water became stone within minutes. And you think a tiger's mind works like a soldier's? I think, Nikolai said carefully, that a tiger won't jump into water it can't see the bottom of. I think 6 feet is too far to leap comfortably from a standstill. I think steam rising from the surface makes it look even more uncertain, more dangerous. He paused, wiping frozen sweat from his forehead. My grandfather wrote about it in his engineering journals. The psychology of barriers. How uncertainty defeats courage. How unknown depth defeats known strength. I think those principles apply to any predator with enough intelligence to feel doubt. And if you're wrong? Nikolai met the priest's eyes directly. Then I'm wrong about a ditch, and I'll build a fence like everyone else. But if I'm wrong about a fence, I'll be dead before I can build anything else. I'd rather waste 3 months digging than bet my life on timber. The priest left without blessing the project. Nikolai finished it anyway. Now, 8 months later, a tiger was testing his theory. The cat was enormous, easily 500 pounds, with paws the size of dinner plates and eyes that tracked Nikolai's every movement through the window glass. The distinctive scarring across its left shoulder suggested battles with other males, dominance fights that had left their marks on otherwise flawless fur. This was no young cat exploring new territory. This was an apex predator in its prime, driven from the mountains by starvation, experienced enough to know that humans were easy prey when caught in the open. It paced the moat's perimeter with fluid grace, stopping occasionally to sniff the steam rising from the thermal water. Each pause sent Nikolai's heart racing. Was this it? Was this the moment the cat decided to jump? It did not attempt to cross. Nikolai watched from inside, rifle across his knees, barely breathing. His grandfather's engineering manuals lay open on the table beside him, diagrams of medieval fortifications that suddenly seemed very relevant to his survival. He'd read these passages 100 times, memorized the calculations, trusted the theory. But theory looked different with a tiger outside your window. By noon, the tiger had completed 17 circuits of his cabin. Nikolai had counted everyone, marking them in his journal with hands that trembled only slightly. The cat had tested the water's edge 4 times, each time extending one massive paw toward the surface before pulling back. Once, it had crouched as if preparing to spring, muscles bunching beneath striped fur, and Nikolai had stopped breathing entirely, finger tightening on his rifle trigger, prayer half formed on his lips. But the tiger hadn't jumped. Something about the depth, the warmth, the uncertainty of it. Something kept triggering an instinct older than hunger. The cat had conquered every prey animal in these forests, had learned to fear nothing that walked or ran or flew, but it had never learned to trust water it couldn't see the bottom of. At sunset, the tiger disappeared into the forest. Nikolai didn't sleep that night. He sat by his window with his rifle, watching the darkness between the trees, waiting for amber eyes to reappear. They didn't, but he kept watching anyway, because he knew the cat hadn't given up. It had just decided to wait. 3 days later, Alexei Petrov died. The news reached Nikolai at dawn, carried by a breathless neighbor named Dmitry Sokolov, who'd run 2 miles through fresh snow without stopping. His face was pale with more than cold, the kind of pallor that comes from seeing things the human mind isn't designed to process. "Sergei's brother," Sokolov gasped, bent double with hands on knees, steam rising from his sweat-soaked clothing. 2 tigers came over his fence like it wasn't there. 8 feet of solid timber, Nikolai. 8 feet, with iron braces at the corners. They cleared it without breaking stride. Nikolai felt the words hit him like physical blows. Alexei Petrov had helped him unload supplies from the trading post last month, had shown him how to set snares for rabbits, had laughed about the ditch, yes, but without malice. The gentle mockery of a man who'd survived by following rules that had always worked before. Sergei found him in the morning. Sokolov continued, voice breaking. What was left of him? The settlement meeting that night was different from any Nikolai had attended. No laughter now. No vodka jokes about the city boy's ditch. 23 people crowded into Father Dmitri's church, pressing together in the candlelit darkness as if proximity could protect them from what waited in the forest outside. Fear had made them silent. Fear and grief, and the dawning recognition that everything they thought they knew about surviving in tiger country might not be enough. "We need higher fences," Sergei Petrov said. His voice was flat, emptied of everything except grief and cold fury. He stood at the front of the church like a man made of stone, only his eyes alive, and those eyes promised violence to anything that crossed his path. 12 feet, iron spikes along the top. Dig the posts deeper so they can't be knocked loose. "They'll climb it," old Mikhail Antonov said from his corner. Antonov had survived the tiger attacks of 1867, when 17 settlers had died over a 6-week period. He was 83 years old now, bent and weathered, but his eyes still held the clarity of a man who'd looked into death's face and remembered every detail. "I've seen them go up trees faster than squirrels. I've seen them leap onto roofs, squeeze through windows that looked too small for a dog. Height doesn't matter to a tiger. Nothing matters to a hungry tiger except meat." "Then what do you suggest?" Kozlov demanded. His usual calm had cracked. Everyone could hear the fear beneath the anger. "We can't fight them. We can't outrun them. We can't build walls high enough or thick enough to keep them out. What do? Abandon our homes? Let them have the settlement?" The Volkov boys still alive. Every head turned toward Antonov. The old man was looking directly at Nikolai, ignoring the others as if they'd already become irrelevant. 3 days ago, a tiger spent 6 hours outside his cabin, biggest male I've seen in 20 years. I watched it from the ridge with my telescope. It circled that water trench of his like a dog on a chain, paced back and forth, tested the edge, even crouched to spring once, never crossed, never even came close to jumping. Silence filled the church. The candles flickered in some unfelt breeze. "That same tiger killed 2 of my goats that night," Kozlov said slowly, the implications settling over him like cold water. "Went right over my fence like it was stepping over a log. Same tiger, same night, but it couldn't cross the Volkov boys' ditch." More silence. Longer this time. Sergei Petrov turned to look at Nikolai. His eyes held something new. Not respect, not yet, but the beginning of desperate hope. The same hope a drowning man feels when his fingers touch something solid. "Show me," he said. Nikolai took them to his cabin the next morning. 8 men, armed with rifles they all knew wouldn't be enough, walking through forest that suddenly felt like enemy territory. Every shadow could hide a tiger. Every sound could be the last thing they heard. They moved in tight formation, weapons raised, eyes scanning the trees with the paranoid vigilance of prey animals in predator country. The moat steamed gently in the morning cold, its dark blue water perfectly still except where the hot spring inlet created subtle currents. Snow had piled on the banks, making the trench look like a river of ink running through white cotton. The cabin sat in the center of its protective circle, small and vulnerable looking, but somehow defiant. The men examined the trench from every angle. They measured its width with rope, tested its depth with poles, studied how the thermal water kept it liquid, despite temperatures that had frozen solid every other water source in the region. 6 feet across, Nikolai explained, standing on the narrow wooden drawbridge that provided his only access to dry land. Too far for a comfortable standing jump, 5 feet deep, deep enough that they can't see the bottom, can't know if they can touch. The hot spring keeps it at about 60 degrees, which means steam rises constantly. That steam looks like danger, unpredictable, unknown. A tiger can jump 15 feet, Kozlov interrupted, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. Forward, yes, from a running start, on solid ground, with clear visibility of the landing zone. But this isn't a running jump. The bank is narrow and slopes toward the water, no room to build speed. They'd have to leap from essentially a standing position, clear 6 feet of water, and land on another narrow bank they can't properly see. Every instinct tells them no. Petrov stared at the dark blue water, steam rising in lazy spirals that twisted and vanished in the cold air. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. My brother built his fence last spring. Good timber, solid construction, iron brackets at every joint. His voice cracked like ice breaking. He thought he was safe. Fences have weak points, Nikolai said quietly, knowing these words would hurt, saying them anyway because they needed to be said. Gaps, joints, places where the wood settles or the ground shifts, places where a determined predator can find leverage. A tiger will explore every inch of a barrier, testing, until it finds the weakness. And there's always a weakness. He gestured at the moat surrounding them. Water has no weak points. It's the same barrier all the way around. No gap to find, no joint to break, no leverage to exploit. The tiger doesn't need to find a way through, because the barrier isn't made of things. It's made of nothing. Empty space and water. You can't break empty space. Antonov nodded slowly, his ancient eyes reflecting the dark water. I've never seen a cat cross water it couldn't wade. Not once. 50 years in these forests, and not once. February 12th, 4 days after the first attack. The death toll had risen to 7. Nikolai was hauling water from the spring for his cabin's interior supply when he heard the screaming. Not human screaming, worse. The high, terrified shriek of a horse in mortal panic, a sound that cut through the forest silence like a blade through silk. It came from the direction of the Kozlov homestead, half a mile east. Then rifle, shots, 5 in quick succession, too fast for aimed fire, the desperate shooting of a man who knew he was out of time. Then nothing. Nikolai ran for his cabin. He was 200 yards away when he saw them emerge from the tree line. 3 tigers, moving in formation like soldiers executing a battle plan, spreading out to cut off his escape routes with the tactical precision of wolves hunting elk. They'd learned to work together, hunger teaching cooperation that solitary predators normally disdained. The largest was the same male that had circled his cabin 5 days earlier. Nikolai recognized the distinctive scarring on its left shoulder, now accompanied by fresh scratches that told of recent violence. It had brought friends, or perhaps followers, drawn by the promise of prey that couldn't fight back. Nikolai ran faster than he'd ever run in his life. The tigers didn't hurry. They'd chased prey before. They knew exactly how this ended, had ended it the same way hundreds of times with deer, with boar, with anything that tried to escape on legs slower than theirs. This human was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. 100 yards to the cabin. Nikolai's lungs burned with cold air drawn too fast. 50 yards. His boots slipped on ice, nearly sending him sprawling. He caught himself, kept running, didn't look back, because looking back meant slowing down, and slowing down meant dying. 30 yards. He could see the trench now, the dark water, the wooden drawbridge he'd built for exactly this moment. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Every fortification needs a single point of entry. Control the entry, control the survival. 20 yards. Behind him, the sound of acceleration. The Tigers had stopped playing. He hit the drawbridge at full sprint, grabbed the release rope without slowing, and yanked with every ounce of strength his exhausted body could produce. The bridge swung upward. 600 pounds of tiger skidded to a halt at the water's edge, so close that Nikolai could see the individual whiskers on its face, could smell the carrion stench of its breath, could look directly into amber eyes that held nothing but hunger and rage. The tiger snarled, a sound like canvas tearing in a hurricane, and tested the water with one enormous paw. It pulled back immediately. Nikolai collapsed against his cabin door, chest heaving, watching 3 apex predators pace the perimeter of his moat with murder in their eyes. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold his rifle. His legs felt like water, but he was alive. "Thank you, grandfather," he whispered to the cold air. They stayed for 4 days. 4 days of pacing, snarling, testing. 4 days of Nikolai watching from his window with rifle ready, food supplies dwindling, sleep impossible, wondering constantly if he'd miscalculated something, missed some variable that would let them find a way across. On day 2, the scarred male made his serious attempt. Nikolai saw it coming, the way the tiger backed up 20 feet from the moat's edge, the way it gathered its haunches beneath it, the way it measured the distance with those terrible amber eyes. He raised his rifle, knowing he'd probably only get 1 shot, knowing 1 shot probably wouldn't be enough. When the tiger leapt, the world seemed to slow down. 600 pounds of muscle and fury arcing through the Siberian air, front paws extended toward the far bank like grasping hands, every line of its body expressing the absolute certainty of a predator who had never failed to reach its prey. And falling short. The splash was enormous. The tiger's scream was worse, a sound of pure animal panic, completely alien coming from a creature that had never known fear, as it plunged into water too deep to stand in, too warm to feel safe, too confining to allow its usual grace. For 30 seconds that felt like hours. The great cat thrashed in terror, claws scrabbling at the timber-reinforced bank, all dignity abandoned in the desperate need to escape the element it couldn't dominate. When it finally hauled itself out, streaming water, shaking with cold and shock despite the thermal warmth of the spring-fed moat, something fundamental had changed. The tiger retreated to the tree line on trembling legs and didn't approach the water again for the rest of the siege. The other 2 took the lesson. They continued circling, continued snarling, continued staring at Nikolai with eyes that promised death if he ever left his island of safety. But they didn't jump. The failed attempt had confirmed what instinct had been warning them all along. This water was not to be trusted. This water was enemy territory. On the morning of day 5, they were gone. The final count, when the attacks ended in late February. 23 dead across the Ussuri settlements. Men, women, children. The tigers hadn't discriminated. Every single victim had died behind wooden fences, behind timber walls, behind barriers that seemed solid until they weren't. Nikolai Volkov was the only settler in the direct path of hunting tigers to survive uninjured. Sergei Petrov came to see him in March, after the ground had thawed enough to dig graves for the dead. The big frontiersman stood at the edge of the moat, his brother's grave fresh in the settlement cemetery, his fence torn down and burned because he couldn't stand to look at it anymore, and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotions he'd spent a lifetime learning to suppress. "I laughed at you. When you were digging this, I told the others you were building your own grave." Nikolai stood beside him, looking at the same dark water that had saved his life. He didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like gloating, and he had no desire to gloat over a man who'd lost his brother. "I was wrong." Petrov turned to face him directly, eyes red but steady. "I've been building fences for 28 years. My brother died behind one of my fences. And you dug a ditch and filled it with water, and 3 tigers couldn't touch you for 4 days." He extended his hand, the first time he'd offered that gesture to the exile boy from St. Petersburg. "Teach me." By autumn, half the settlement had water barriers. The work was brutal. Siberian earth didn't yield easily, and not every homestead had access to thermal springs. But the memory of 23 bodies was stronger than any complaint about labor. Settlers who had mocked Nikolai's ditch now begged him to help them dig their own. By the following spring, the design had spread to 3 neighboring villages, carried by survivors who'd lost family and refused to lose anyone else. The Vladivostok Gazette ran an article in 1897 calling it the Volkov method, a military engineering solution to a wilderness problem, developed by a 17-year-old exile who'd listened to his grandfather's stories while other boys played soldier. Nikolai married Petrov's daughter in 1895. The courtship had been brief, almost businesslike, 2 people recognizing in each other the strength to survive whatever came next. They named their first son Alexei, and Sergei Petrov wept at the christening. 70 years later, researchers from the Siberian Tiger Project would document what Nikolai had figured out, with nothing but intuition and desperation: that Amur tigers consistently refuse to cross water barriers wider than 4 feet when depth is uncertain. The instinct is hardwired, older than the species itself, a remnant of evolutionary history that even starvation cannot override. Their studies would cite the 1892 attacks as historical evidence of the principle in action. But Nikolai didn't need research to validate what he already knew. He'd watched 3 tigers circle his cabin for 4 days and never cross 6 feet of water. Some walls don't need to be tall. They just need to be wet.